Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for taking the time to come. The situation of the opioid epidemic in Minnesota is one that a day doesn't go by where we don't have a story in the papers, on TV. It's one that's touched all of our families. These are our children dying. These are our neighbors dying. It is taking an incredible human toll as well as an economic toll on our state. We're not alone in that. Other states are too. I'm simply have to say that I'm proud of the Minnesota legislature who has made this a priority. It appears like both in the Senate and the House, pieces of legislation are moving faster and have broader support than we've seen in the past. And it's my expectation before this session started, and it's been reinforced now, that a piece of meaningful legislation will end up on my desk that I will sign that will start to address this. In keeping with the way that I have always led, in keeping with the promises that I made to Minnesota, that engaging meaningful conversations of everyone involved in this, whether it's from victims to physicians to that entire supply chain to the distributors and the manufacturers of these opioids. So I just completed a conference call with a large number of folks, both operating here in Minnesota and nationally, to get their input. To ask them what they can do to be a part of this solution, and to try and give a lay of the land of where this is coming down and what their role is going to be in helping us get to the end of session. Because I want to be clear, like so many Minnesotans, great frustrations last year where we had legislation moving, we had the hearings, we had some potential solutions, we had ways to start to address this, and then we had a lobbying blitz at the end of the time, and we had confusion thrown in, and we got nothing. We got nothing out of that. I do not want that to happen again. And I want to just be clear, especially with the work that I did in pain management in the VA as a member of Congress. I've worked closely on formularies. I've worked closely on pieces of legislation with these manufacturers that improve people's lives. So I want to be clear that there are life-saving pain reductions, life and quality enhancing opportunities that come. The research and development that is done by these companies give us longer life expectancies, again, reduce pain, improve quality of life. So this is not about demonizing an industry, but it's about an understanding that the consumption of the vast amount of opioids in this country, understanding that the 20 top pharmaceutical companies in the world make 80% of their profits on price increases in the United States alone, not on new drugs, not on people using them. So I'm looking to them as major players in the industry to help us. And it was very clear by the folks on the phone. They share that ethical compassion that we have to reduce the number of people impacted by opioid addiction. We have to do a better job of managing how these things get into the hands of the wrong people. And we have to take responsibility, both as a state and as an industry, to make that happen. And so it was a good conversation. It's one that I've made it clear that my expectation is a piece of legislation will end up on my desk that will provide a funding source and a plan to start reducing the impact of the opioid epidemic in Minnesota. I'm also very clear with them that I understand this is much broader. It goes to every single one of us in terms of how do we go about using these, how do we go about prescribing them, how do we go about disposing of them. All of the things that are part of that supply chain are going to be discussed. But as it stands right now, my message was I want these manufacturers to be partners with us. I want them to help be constructive in their dialogue over the next few weeks as these pieces of legislation move. And my hope is that we can find an equitable position that I do think hits where our shared goals are, making sure that people who need these pharmaceuticals to reduce pain and used in a responsible manner are able to get them at an affordable price, at the same time making it more difficult for people who shouldn't have them to get them, and making sure that we have the resources to treat people who are already addicted or impacted by these, making sure law enforcement and first responders have what they need to treat these, and then making sure we move people on to recovery. So I think it's a conversation that was probably a long time in coming. I think it's one that we should expect this as the norm as we deal with legislation. I'm also not naive to understand that this is a very hard lift when you're asking folks to give, to help for something. But I came away from the conversation hopeful, and I want to reiterate too that my thanks to both the House and the Senate and the leadership in both of those bodies for working for the good of Minnesota's families and the good of the state in crafting these pieces of legislation. So with that, please, any question?
Did you get assurances from them that there would not be another last-minute lobbying blitz? And if there is, what kind of action are you considering?
No, I did not get assurances, but I made it clear that one of the things that I know is reputation management. One of the things that I need to be fairly good at is understanding public will. There will be no tolerance this year for that. I didn't use it as a threat, but I reminded them that just 9% of the public believes that pharmaceutical companies put patients above profits, and I think that is a reality that they'll have to come to grips with. Again, being very clear that I have not spent my career demonizing these industries. I have expressed my frustrations and outrage at times when things happen, but I will equally acknowledge the R&D that they've done has improved the lives of my sister, for example, when she was going through chemotherapy and things. Those are things that we need to recognize, but I did not get those assurances, but what I did make clear is that it's in my best estimate these pieces of legislation will pass the House and the Senate, and they will eventually end up on my desk. And I think it's in their best interest to engage now in a constructive manner to improve those bills, not just for their bottom line, but to improve them for the long-range solutions that they think are there. And I don't deny that there's an argument to be made. The supply chain is much broader than just the manufacturers and distributors, but the fact of the matter is right now, and especially where we're dealing with a crisis situation, we're going to have to triage out first the worst of this and then start working back in the reductions, because we didn't really get in this crisis overnight. We're not going to get out of it overnight, but every day we wait in expanding treatment and options and Narcan and all of the things that we can do, we're losing people, and that's unacceptable.
Governor, how much do you care about the funding mechanism for this? You know, penny a pill, loss momentum.
Well, I care that the funding is there. And I know, again, I want to be clear, I think the House and Senate members who have delved deeper into this have a better understanding what is the best way to make that happen, what is possible to make it happen. What we end up getting in is that what I don't want is a slow walk to the end of a session and kill something of debating on where this is going to come from. We're going to have to make a decision on where it's come from at some point. We're going to have to vote on it, and then I'm going to have to sign it or veto it. And I don't want this to be where we let the perfect get in the way of the good. It's time to get a good bill out of there and get it functioning.
Governor, the House bill has moved. It has passed one committee already. The Senate bill has not. Do you have concerns in the Senate?
No, I don't think at this time. I think certainly our lead authors over there are experienced, well-respected legislators. The Senate, whether I like it or not, moves at its own pace, and that happens in the United States Senate as well as the Minnesota Senate. No, I don't think so. I think these are well-thought-out pieces of legislation. I think the end of the last session and what happened probably steeled folks more to get this done. So I'm confident it'll get there. Again, on this conference call was just to make, now is the time to actively engage. Now is the time to re-engage with these authors who are building strong bipartisan coalition and have the public will behind them to make sure, because I want to make sure this works. And I trust, again, the legislators will get there. But we have to have broad buy-in by everybody involved.
Governor, did you get the impression that the pharmaceutical industry understands they have some responsibility to help with this problem, even if they're not saying it's their fault?
Yes.
Did you get the sense that they understand that they have some responsibility?
Yeah, undoubtedly. And I think, again, I think it's important for us to keep in mind that they approach that from both the ethical and the moral perspective and spoke that. They understand that. I think their point is that they feel like there's a broader responsibility down an entire supply chain. And I suppose their concern is that they're being singled out more. That's not all that different in many of these different scenarios that come up. But they're very clear about it, that they want to make a difference. But then they bring up the other side of it is, we don't want you to do something that makes it more difficult for people who really need these to be able to get them. We don't want you to do something that raises the price. And these are all debatable issues. But they were approaching it from absolutely. They agree that they understand something needs to be done. They understand that they need to be part of the solution.
Do they claim they'll just pass the cost on to the consumer?
No. Well, the cost will go up. I think there's it. And I think all of us know the situation in New York where they put in their provision there was no pass-through provision that ended up in court saying that if we do this, you can't pass these on to the consumers. I think most of us recognize whenever we do these things that there is an attempt to pass it on to the consumer, whether it's adding anti-lock brakes in automobiles, the price went up, even though it improved safety. So that's one of the claims. I'm certainly cognizant of the cost of consumers, but it's pretty hard for me right now, especially what happens with insulin costs and EpiPen and all of that, to realize that there's some pretty solid profits happening, and we can figure this.
Anyway, aren't they? Because you just said that 80% of their profit comes not from new drugs, but from price increases on existing drugs. So
Yeah,
is
take that
that a
into-
viable argument for them?
That statistic is really stunning, and I think this is one about making it clear, again, about not going out of my way to demonize an industry, but I think there's maybe something wrong with the business model here. 20 of the world's largest, in Europe, across the world, 20 largest pharmaceutical companies make 80% of their profits on price increases in the United States. That speaks to volumes with their business model. I would argue it speaks volume with our broken healthcare system. So yes, certainly a reality. My point to them is this crisis is upon us now, and this funding will be used to triage those crises, those in situations, those at the point of dying if we don't have first responders ready at the time or if we don't have treatments. So we're approaching it that. I'm not going to deny the pieces of legislation that move are not going to fix the long-range problem all the way by themselves, but it gives us the first real tangible move in that direction, and we can build on it.
Folks, we have time for one more question.
From a budgetary perspective, though, you're crafting the state budget, and the after effects of the epidemic are playing out in county budgets and courts and everything else. So I know some of the senators have talked about how these companies need to pay for the long-term effects. Are you on board with that?
Well, in our budget, I think you'll see reflected some of these realities of these added costs that go to counties, and that's what we're talking about in this piece of legislation. I think that discussion is valid. We have not, again, I think it's important that this was a move in a direction, as Tom's question asked, is that there was an acknowledgement of that we're part of this, just as so many others are. We want to be part of the solution. I think this piece of legislation dealing with this is probably the first way to go, and there may be further conversations down the road. And I think for all of us, you recognize this, that some of the fear out of these companies is an acknowledgement that we are part of this, feels like an acknowledgement that now all of a sudden every state's going to come, everyone's going to ask. I'm cognizant of that. I'm listening to them on that piece. But again, my responsibility has to be Minnesotans are dying because these things are being put in the wrong hands. There's something wrong with how we're doing this. They brought up the point, and again, there's validity in this. Illegal or knockoff fentanyl that's ending up in this country. They said, what is this piece of legislation going to do against that? Nothing, but that's a different thing that we need to deal with. It doesn't mean because of that we don't deal with what's in front of us. So we have time we can take another couple.
Do you think this call was sufficient to get your message across, or do you see other ways you need to turn up the heat a little on these companies?
Well, I think you need to approach it in good faith, that all of these folks got on the call. There was a very candid conversation, and some of the answers started out, can I speak candidly? And they did. And I responded back, I'm going to speak candidly about this is the reality of where this is at, and this is what I think. I think it starts to maybe build some of that that coalition again. I'm not naive. This is hard. This was one 45-minute conversation. I think there were valid points that were brought up. But again, I keep coming back to we're in a situation that is crisis. There's solutions out there. We have bipartisan support and a piece of legislation is moving. It was my intent to maybe reignite and get them back in the conversation that is not just meant to stop what's happening, to see and to have them feel validated, at least that they were being heard about what their concerns were. Whether they were agreed with that or not was probably less important than hearing them.
Are you talking to lobbyists or heads of corporations? Are these some of the larger pharmaceuticals? Can you give us any
They were their
idea?
vice presidents of corporate affairs. I think it's there's some of those, though, yeah. And we were trying, my goal would have been to speak to their CEOs, which if they're listening, the advice I would give them is be part of this solution with us, be part of a candid conversation, work with these incredibly talented legislators who are on both sides of the aisle, not trying to demonize, but trying to find solutions. And it seemed like a pretty healthy conversation. But again, the proof is going to be when this piece of legislation gets done and if it's actually improving lives. And I'm telling the legislators get it. They told me, I'm in agreement with them. This thing needs to get to my desk sooner rather than later. And now is the time for everyone who's interested and anyone who cares about this issue to get deeply involved. I got time for one more. Someone was asking in the back. Yeah.
Governor, if you don't mind, unprecedented hearing tomorrow at Stillwater Prison. The slaying of Officer Gahn is going to be. Is that going to be reflected in your budget, and what are your thoughts on that generally in protection for corrections officers?
Yes, it will be reflected, and I think some of you have heard me say this, and just to be clear, when I announced Commissioner Schnell was on the same day I announced Commissioner Richter and Commissioner Olson, that we see this holistically, that as a state, if we end up spending more on corrections than we do on education, we've lost. But we also know that my responsibility is the protection of Minnesota's people. It's the protection of those correction officers who are there, and it's the protection of the inmates who are being asked to serve a sentence, but then being able to be released back, making sure that our recidivism rates are low. So we know that we have a crowding situation. We know we have an unacceptable assault on our corrections officers that cannot stand. And we need to recognize that there's going to be short-term triaging there of making sure that we have enough corrections officers and support on the floor. But once again, these folks are approaching this, and it maybe goes back to this opioid epidemic, the number of folks that we're incarcerating that have addiction issues, and we have no counselors for them. We have no treatments for them, and then we end up at times sending folks back onto the streets without addressing those core problems. So I think this hearing will focus on how do we make these corrections facilities safer. But I'm also asking the commissioner, and he's never far from this, what do we do on the front end to reduce incarceration rates, and then at the end to make sure that recidivism rates are low? The same thing I think could be said of this epidemic, that in this regards, one of the representatives on the phone call talked about it needs to be in our best interest to get to the very front of this, reducing the number of prescriptions that are needing to be filled, reducing the number of injuries, whatever they might be, that are causing people to have to get these painkillers, and then all the way through that supply chain doing all we can so that if we get to the end where we have addiction and overdoses, that is much rarer than it is now. So this plays right into that. I'm grateful and long overdue that we did one of these in these facilities. Those of you who have ever been out to Stillwater or seen, we can do better in the state of Minnesota. We can do better in terms of protection of our corrections officers. We can do better in the treatment of our inmates. And we can certainly do better in reducing the number of folks that we're incarcerating by making sure that everybody has that education, that opportunity on the front end. So thank you for being here.
Thank you all.
Teddy, can you get us this?